It began, as many of my recollections tend to, with a sound rather than a sight. A low, uneven thread of music drifting through the nave of St. Michael's, on Cornmarket, something half forgotten, not quite Bach, but touched with his ghostly precision. I had entered only to escape the rain, yet found myself arrested by that tremulous organ note that hung in the air like an unanswered question. The church was empty, save for the organist, an elderly man whose back was straight, despite his years. His fingers moved without confidence, hesitant in the softer passages. I stood near the door, reluctant to disturb what appeared less a rehearsal than a private confession. Outside, Oxford pressed on with its endless drizzle umbrellas, bicycles, and scholars late for seminars. Inside, time seemed suspended, the air dense with incense and echoes. I had come, truth be told, to think there was a case, though at that hour I preferred to pretend there wasn't. A young don from St. Bede's dead, in what the coroner had already deemed accidental circumstances. Gas leak, faulty valve, no suggestion of foul play. Except there were the letters unsigned, literary in tone, found in his desk like some cruel correspondence with conscience itself. And then the photograph of a woman, torn clean down the middle. The organist finished with a faltering cadence. He turned slightly, as if aware of my presence, but did not speak. I moved forward past the pews, each one polished by generations of uncertain faith. He began again this time something minor, mournful, and I realized it was the same melody reversed. A voluntary, yes, but inverted. I have always been suspicious of inversions. They rarely occur by chance. Later I would think about that. The reversed melody, the torn photograph, the dead man who had no family and yet had kept, carefully folded, a child's drawing of a garden. Each fragment mirrored another, each absence forming part of a pattern that only appeared once viewed obliquely. He spoke at last, the organist, without turning. I play better when it rains. Something about the acoustics, I told him. I understood, though I didn't. He asked whether I enjoyed the music. I said I did and meant it. There was a pause, long enough for the truth to seem comfortable. Then he added, without invitation, that the man who usually played here had died last month. Gas, they said. Terrible thing. A scholar, wasn't he? St. Bede's. I looked at the back of his head, at the sparse, white hair, and felt that familiar prickle of reluctant certainty. The world is never as coincidental as we hope. He seemed to sense my thoughts. They asked me to take his place, just until the college appoints another. He was a fine musician, but careless, left the pipes uncleaned, the bellows unmended. He stopped, as if aware of the implication, and began gathering his sheet music. I told him I was from the police, that I had come to ask about his predecessor. The look he gave me was one of quiet resignation. Not surprise exactly, but the weary knowledge that conversation would now become confession, even if no crime had yet been named. He spoke of the dead man's habits, his lateness, his temper, his fondness for sherry, of a woman, perhaps imaginary, who sent letters written on cream paper, always unsigned, always scented faintly of violets. Outside, the bells of Carfax struck 5. I left him to his music and stepped again into the wet Oxford evening. The streets glistened like ink on old parchment, and I thought of the reversed melody, the symmetry of a death that seemed both accidental and arranged. Somewhere, faintly, I could still hear the organ's final chord unfinished, unresolved, slipping into silence as if reluctant to declare itself. Later, at Randolph, with a whiskey that burned less than it used to, I noted the name of the organist, his age, and his parish. I also wrote a question. Why clean the pipes of an instrument you do not intend to play? It was a small thing, a crossword clue of a detail, but something in it felt deliberate. A man dies, another takes his place, and the melody plays backward just slightly wrong. I have learned to trust such imperfections. They are, in their way, the closest thing we have to truth. The next evening I found myself in the college chapel, drawn there not by faith but by a sort of weary curiosity. The choir was rehearsing for evensong, and the sound of their voices rose like a fragile argument against the darkness outside. Boys' trebles, pure and slightly sharp at the top, carried over the deeper, slower patience of the men. There is something unbearably human about an imperfect choir. The missed note, the uncertain entry, the small collisions of sound, they remind one that devotion and error are siblings. I sat near the back, beneath the memorial window that turned the last of the daylight into fragments of blood and gold. The choirmaster, a young man with a prematurely lined face, conducted with the caution of someone afraid of beauty. When the music stopped, the silence did not fall so much as deepen. I stayed where I was, listening to the absence of sound, thinking of the dead organist from St. Bede's, the gas, the letters, the reversed melody. The choirmaster noticed me eventually. He came down the aisle with the diffidence of a man intruding on his own sanctuary. He said something about visitors being welcome, though he sounded unconvinced. I told him my name, my occupation, and he looked as though he had expected something quite different. He said he had known the deceased only in passing, a competent musician, though increasingly distracted of late. He used to come here sometimes, uninvited, to listen to the rehearsals. Said he liked the acoustics? I asked if that seemed odd. He hesitated, then said everything about the man had seemed slightly off-key. The boy sopranos drifted past us, whispering, tugging their cassocks straight. One of them, a pale, sharp-eyed child, with a scholar's seriousness, turned back at the door. He asked whether the dead man would still be buried with music. The choirmaster told him yes, softly, as though to preserve some faith not yet examined. I lingered, after they had gone, walking slowly along the stalls. Each carved nameplate bore witness to a century of anonymous devotion. Dust had settled unevenly, forming ghostly outlines where hymnals had once rested. I thought of how music lingers, even after the notes fade, how the memory of sound can haunt a room more persistently than the sound itself. That, I suppose, is true of most things worth remembering. In the vestry a small lamp burned with that sickly yellow peculiar to ecclesiastical electricity. There was a desk, an inkwell, and a ledger open to the most recent entry. I noticed the handwriting was neat, angular, deliberate, and not the choirmaster's. It recorded the loan of a hymn book dated 2 days before the organist's death. The name beside it had been smudged, as though wiped away before the ink was dry. But the title of the hymn caught my attention. Lead, Kindly Light. A sentimental choice for a scholar, but then sentiment is the last refuge of intellect when logic runs out. Later, as I walked back across the quad, I paused beneath the cloisters to light a cigarette. The rain had started again, a fine mist that blurred the lamps and softened the edges of the buildings. The choir had dispersed, yet I could still hear their final chord, or thought I could tremble faintly in the air, unfinished. I remembered the organist's volunteer from the previous day, the melody reversed, and it occurred to me that Lead Kindly Light too could be inverted, its consolation turned quietly into lament. I wondered whether that was what he had intended all along, a farewell disguised as faith. At the gate, I saw the choirmaster again, locking up. He mentioned, without my asking, that the organ in this chapel had also been serviced recently by the same firm that tended to St. Bede's. He said it with the absent-mindedness of a man making conversation, but I could not ignore it. There are coincidences, and then there are patterns wearing the mask of chance. I asked who had arranged the work. He thought for a moment, then said the request had come in writing. No signature, but the letter had smelled faintly of violets. I didn't tell him that I already knew that scent, that it lingered not only on the letters found in the dead man's desk, but also, faintly, on my own coat sleeve, where the organist's hand had brushed mine in farewell. Instead, I thanked him and left, the sound of the rain following me through the archway. In Oxford, even silence has a sound, and that night it was the echo of a choir still singing somewhere in memory, asking a question that no living soul seemed ready to answer. It was on the following morning, grey and indecisive, that I first met Dr. Selby. A man of music, theology, and that strange Oxford breed of loneliness that cloaks itself in accomplishment. He lived in a house on the northern edge of Jericho, the sort of house that still pretended its garden mattered. A cello leaned against the wall in the hallway, its varnish dulled by neglect. There was a faint odour of tobacco and polish, and faintly beneath both, the slow decay of paper. He received me with courtesy, though not warmth. I recognized the type at once, men who confuse privacy with virtue. He poured coffee into small cups that looked better suited to confession than hospitality. I asked about the late organist, and he paused just long enough to make me notice the pause. Then he said that he had taught him harmony years ago, when the younger man still believed that discipline could rescue art from chaos. They had not spoken in recent months. A disagreement, he said, overphrasing. I have never known a quarrel about music that was truly about music. He led me into a study where the walls were lined with shelves of scores of Bach, Tallis, Palestrina, and in the centre a piano covered with sheets of ruled paper. Each contained a few measures written in pencil, erased, rewritten, and abandoned. He called it his Mass for one voice, and smiled with the embarrassment of a man caught praying. I looked closer at the three distinct sections marked Adagio, Lento, Reprise. The third movement ended mid-bar. He noticed me studying it, said that he could never complete the piece. Every time he tried, the first note of the reprise fell into the wrong key. I told him that perhaps the key was never the point. He said something in Latin I half understood, in fine silentium. In the end, silence. There was a photograph on the piano. Two men standing beside the chapel organ, smiling awkwardly, their hands resting on the same keyboard. The younger man, my dead organist, was looking not at the camera, but at Selby. It was not affection in his gaze, it was recognition. I asked when it was taken. He said a year ago, perhaps 2. I didn't believe him. The photograph had been moved recently, and the dust mark was still visible on the lid of the piano. I mentioned, almost idly, that the organist's replacement had been playing a reversed voluntary. A small thing, perhaps, but odd. Selby's fingers twitched against the rim of his cup. He said there was a logic to inversion, that to reverse a melody is to reveal its skeleton. Then softer, perhaps, he played it that way for me. When I left, the rain had started again, light as breath. I stood under the eaves and lit a cigarette, thinking about those 3 movements. Adagio, Lento, Reprise. The first a beginning slowed by hesitation, the second a dirge disguised as reflection, the third left unfinished, like a man's last sentence cut short. It seemed to me that Selby's composition mirrored something more than art. Perhaps guilt too comes in movement awareness, concealment, repetition. Back at the station, I went through the inventory of the dead man's possessions once more. There, among the letters and music, was a folded programme from a recital at the Sheldonian. Dr. Selby listed as accompanist the piece Mass for one voice, but the date was 2 years ago, which meant the composition had once been finished after all, before he claimed to have abandoned it. It was then that the faintest echo of deduction began to stir. A melody reversed, a mass unwritten, a friendship inverted into silence. I returned the programme to the file and closed it gently, as if afraid the truth might wake. There are moments when one senses that the music of a life has already reached its final chord, and all that remains is the reverberation, the long, unresolving sound that no amount of reason can quite extinguish. It was a luncheon I had not intended to attend. Lewis, ever the optimist, had suggested that conversation might loosen the threads of the case, though I suspected his real motive was hunger. The place was the King's Arms, a dim, wood-panelled refuge from the wet Oxford afternoon. The windows steamed faintly, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and damp wool. She was already there when we arrived, Mrs. Halberd, widow of the late Dean's secretary, seated by the window as though accustomed to waiting. A narrow woman, hands restless against the linen, her grief tidily pressed into silence. She greeted me without warmth, but not without curiosity, that curious blend of courtesy and contempt peculiar to the bereaved who suspect they are being pitied. We ordered wine at St. Emilion, 1970, chosen from a list too fine for the surroundings. She nodded approvingly. My husband admired a good vintage, she said, though he preferred his bottles unopened. She smiled faintly at the contradiction, and I thought how much truth is revealed in offhand irony. The talk drifted, as it must, to the dead organist from St. Bede's. She had known him only by correspondence he had written often, she said, about music, about faith, about the possibility of forgiveness. She did not specify whose forgiveness he sought. I asked whether her husband had ever mentioned him. Only once, she said, after a college concert. He thought the man was too talented for his own good. That phrase lingered talent as a form of guilt. When the first glass was poured, she did not drink immediately. Instead, she studied the label, tracing the vintage with one finger, as if searching for something lost. Then she said quietly that her husband had kept meticulous records of every bottle he bought, every cork he drew. A seller of order. I asked if I might see those records. She said she had destroyed them, all except one, the list of wines purchased in the last year of his life. She had found it folded inside a hymnal, as though meant to be discovered. She handed it to me then, a single sheet of paper, creased and faintly scented with old smoke. Each entry bore a date, a price, and, curiously, a set of initials. Not the suppliers, that much was clear. Some of them formed a pattern. DS, SB, CM names, perhaps, or notes. I folded the paper carefully and asked what she thought the initials meant. She said she had once believed they marked the people with whom her husband intended to share those bottles, but the quantities were wrong. He had bought in pairs, yet always drank alone. As we spoke, Lewis busied himself with the bread, pretending not to listen. The rain deepened outside, turning the window pane into a pale mirror. I saw her reflection eyes fixed not on me but somewhere just beyond, as though the city itself were whispering an accusation. She told me that on the night her husband died in an accident, the inquest said, in a fall in his cellar she had found an uncorked bottle beside him. A Bordeaux, the same vintage we were drinking, but the glass on the table had been untouched. I asked if she had kept the bottle. She said no, though something in her hesitation betrayed uncertainty. People often confuse the act of disposal with the act of forgetting. When she left, she did so without farewell, the faint perfume of violets following her like a memory half erased. Later in my office, I spread the wine list beside the letters from St. Bede's. One set of initials matched perfectly, DS for Dr. Selby. Another, SB, corresponded to the dead organist's college. The pattern began to breathe. Wine bought for company never drunk, names reduced to letters, deaths that echoed each other in tone, if not in form. I poured myself the last of the St. Emilion and watched the rain slide down the glass. There are evenings when Oxford feels less like a city than a confession, murmured too late when every bottle, every note, every silence seems to speak the same faint truth that what binds the living is seldom love and never entirely chance. There are few things more treacherous than music misplaced, a mislaid score, a missing bar, a rest counted too long, and suddenly the whole design falters. So it was with the cantata. It had existed, that much was certain. Selby had mentioned it once, in a moment of weary pride, as though it were the only truth he still trusted himself to tell. A sacred piece, he'd said, for two voices and an unseen third. He had smiled then, faintly, and I remember thinking that some smiles are not gestures at all but confessions trying to disguise themselves as calm. The manuscript, according to the bursar at St. Bede's, had been stored in the college library within a folder marked Selby Early Works. Yet when we searched, only the folder remained. The pages had vanished. I asked the librarian, an aging woman whose spectacles seemed perpetually fogged by the climate of disapproval she carried with her, whether the piece had ever been catalogued. She said Selby had requested anonymity. That in itself was interesting. In Oxford, anonymity is never a virtue. It is a kind of confession whispered in code. Lewis, ever patient, turned over the folder and found, written faintly in pencil on the inside flap, a single word requiem. I said it was strange because a cantata is rarely written as a requiem. He said perhaps Selby had changed his mind, but change of mind implies doubt, and doubt implies feeling. I had not yet decided whether Selby was capable of either. Outside, the afternoon was closing in with its familiar grey reluctance. We walked across the quad, our footsteps flattening puddles of rain into dull mirrors. I could not help but think of the widow's wine list with those initials inked beside the vintages small as fingerprints, DS for Selby, CM for someone else. And then, most curiously, a final entry without letters at all, only a date the night the organist had died. In the evening I returned to the library alone. I told the porter it was official business. He nodded, unimpressed. The place was nearly empty, save for the faint crackle of radiators and the smell of paper surrendering to time. I moved through the shelves until I reached the music section. There, amid the neat chaos of spines, I found something that should not have been there, a thin, leather-bound notebook shelved under philosophy. No title on the cover. Inside, no words. Only staves drawn by hand, each bearing a few scattered notes. The handwriting was unmistakably Selby's, yet the music, what little there was of it, did not sound like him. The intervals were awkward, the rhythm strained, as though someone had been trying to remember a melody from a dream and failing. On the final page, written vertically along the margin, was a phrase in Latin, cantus sub silentio, the song beneath silence. I copied the notes on a scrap of paper and took them to a friend in the music faculty, a man whose life's work had been to understand composers who never quite finished their work. He played the fragment once, without comment, then again, slower. The melody, incomplete though it was, mirrored the opening of the reversed voluntary I had heard in St. Michael's, only mirrored, not identical. I asked him what he made of it. He said it was as if two people had written it together, one echoing the other in reverse. That night I sat in my room at Randolph, the score spread before me like a map that refused to reveal its own destination. I poured myself a whiskey, then another, though it made no difference. The music, the little I could hear of it in my head, contained something both tender and cruel. A duet, perhaps. A conversation between guilt and forgiveness. Before I fell asleep, I wrote a single line in my notebook. The missing cantata is not lost. It was never written to be found. In Oxford we lose many things: umbrellas, ideals, lovers, faith. But the most dangerous loss of all is the one that pretends to be deliberate. And in that half-written cantata, in those mirrored notes that refused to resolve, I felt the unmistakable presence of intention, quiet, practiced, and deadly. It was a week after the discovery of the missing cantata when the notion of the wrong key first took root in my mind, not the musical kind, though it began that way. I had gone to Selby's rooms in St. Bede's to collect the last of his papers. He had vanished 2 days earlier, leaving a note to the porter claiming he'd gone to visit family in York. But no one in York, nor anywhere else, knew of such relations. People rarely vanish without rehearsal. Selby, I felt, had practiced his disappearance for years. The rooms were ascetic to the point of parody. A single armchair, an empty decanter, the smell of stale coffee clinging to the curtains. On the desk lay a sheaf of scores, fragments, sketches, ideas too uncertain to commit to form. Among them I found a page marked Adagio in G minor, transposed. The ink was wet enough to smudge, though the rain outside had stopped the night before. Transposed a word with more than one meaning, I thought. Lewis busied himself with drawers, ever thorough, while I examined the upright piano that dominated the room. Its lid was closed, but a single key middle C had been pressed and wedged slightly out of line, as if struck too hard or too often. I touched it, and it remained stubbornly silent. Beneath the key was a faint glint of metal. A key, yes, but not a musical one. It was small, of brass, tied with a faded red ribbon, and bore the inscription S.B. Library. I told Lewis to note it, though I already knew that it must open the side cabinet in the library that held the bound volumes of chapel accounts and musical manuscripts. Selby, it seemed, had transposed more than notes. He had shifted the truth itself one lock for another, one meaning for its mirror. Later that evening I returned alone to St. Bede's, the quad deserted, the air sharp with that particular cold that arrives after rain. The library's great door yielded easily. Inside, the silence had a physical weight, the kind that makes even the turning of a page feel intrusive. I used the brass key on the narrow cabinet near the music section. It turned, reluctantly, with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside, no records, only a single envelope resting against the back panel. On its front, in Selby's angular hand, Cantata, Final Movement. I took it to one of the reading lamps and unfolded the sheets. 3 pages of music, delicately written, the ink still new. Beneath the final stave, a note in Latin clavis falsa, veritas vera, the wrong key, the true truth. I copied it carefully into my notebook, uncertain whether I was transcribing a confession or a riddle. On the walk back to the car, I found myself thinking of the widow again, her quiet defiance, her knowledge of wines and their years. The wine list she had given me had contained its own code of letters and numbers. Each bottle is marked not by price but by tone, A minor, F sharp, C. Selby's musical mind transposed into her domestic grief. And the final bottle, unopened, marked only with a dash. Silence as the final note. When I reached home, I placed the brass key beside my glass of whiskey and looked at them both. 2 instruments of truth, one unlocking doors, the other loosening restraint. It occurred to me then that Selby's error, whatever else it was, lay in thinking that music could conceal rather than reveal. Every wrong key, once struck, announces itself in the air long after the player has lifted his hand. That night, before sleep, I played the final movement, softly, on my own piano. The melody began in G minor, but ended, impossibly, in C major, unresolved yet inevitable, like a confession spoken in another tongue. And as the last chord died, I thought I heard, far off in memory, the echo of the choir from weeks before their voices rising again, through stone and distance, as if Oxford itself were trying, very gently, to correct the key. It was Lewis who found it, though he didn't realize what he'd found. We were in the college archives, the kind of place where air feels like parchment, and time itself seems to rust at the edges. He'd been searching through a box of miscellany, the forgotten detritus of academic lives, invitations, receipts, programs yellowed by a century of neglect. He passed the photograph to me almost absently, saying it might be nothing. It rarely is nothing. 3 figures stood in the image. One was unmistakably Selby, younger, less burdened, his eyes still expectant of admiration. To his right, the dead organist, smiling with an awkward stiffness that betrayed dependence rather than friendship. And between them, though slightly apart, as if caught between inclusion and exile, stood a woman. Her face was turned just enough to suggest secrecy. In her hands, a small bouquet of lilies. On the reverse, the date is 1978. I looked at it longer than I meant to. It was not merely the faces that troubled me, but the posture Selby's hand, resting almost protectively on the organist's shoulder, the woman's turned gaze. The composition itself felt deliberate, arranged rather than candid, the sort of photograph taken to prove something, or to disguise it. Lewis, patient as ever, asked whether I recognized the woman. I said I didn't, though that wasn't quite true. I had seen her before, or rather, seen her likeness in a painting that hung in the chapel vestry, donated decades earlier by an anonymous benefactor. The same tilt of the head, the same refusal to meet the viewer's eye. Only now, with the photograph before me, did I notice that the background was identical, the same dark wooden panelling, the same half-visible edge of the organ case. It wasn't a coincidence, nothing in Oxford ever is. I asked Lewis to have the original painting examined for any inscriptions or initials hidden beneath the frame. He said he'd arrange it in the morning. He looked tired, the way honest men look when they realize truth is less comforting than falsehood. That night, I took the photograph home. I laid it on my desk beside a glass of Glenfiddich and stared at it under the lamplight. There was something peculiar about the lilies. Their stems were bound with a dark ribbon, and one of the blooms had been folded back upon itself as though deliberately crushed. I thought of the widow's perfume violets, not lilies, and yet, in memory, the sense began to blur. The deduction, when it came, arrived not with triumph, but weariness. I remembered the small brass key marked S.B. Library, the one found beneath the stuck piano key. Selby's initials, yes, but also St. Bede's, the college itself, the 2 meanings superimposed, one concealing the other. Like the photograph, like the woman's expression. The truth was always there, obscured by the insistence of appearances. I flipped the photograph again, tracing the faint impression of something that had once been written, but erased. Under angled light, a single word emerged, reprise, the title of Selby's unfinished Mass. A coincidence, perhaps, or a message to the future that he assumed no one would ever care to read. I closed my eyes and could almost hear the music again, that hesitant voluntary from St. Michael's, reversed and incomplete. The first notes were uncertain, as though someone were testing a melody half remembered. and then beneath it, a second voice, softer, feminine, impossible to mistake. The lost cantata had not been written for a choir of men, after all. Lewis called the next morning to tell me the chapel painting had been removed from its frame. On the back, beneath layers of dust, they'd found a name inscribed in Selby's hand. Not the artist's, but the subject. I wrote it down in my notebook, closed the cover, and poured another whiskey. There are moments when discovery feels less like illumination and more like trespass, as though one has opened a door that should have stayed locked. I kept the photograph. It sits still in my drawer between old case notes and unposted letters. Sometimes late at night I take it out and study it again. The lilies have darkened with age, the faces faded into ghostly outlines. Only the woman's gaze endures, forever beyond confession, as though she knows that all music, in the end, is composed for the listener who never arrives. I had been listening to a recording of Bach's Goldberg variations when the call came. The irony was not lost on me. There are few compositions that speak so directly to the nature of repetition, to the way a single idea can mutate, fracture, return to itself, altered beyond recognition. Life, crime, memory, all variations upon a single, unfinished theme. The call was from Lewis. He said the chapel archivist had found something among the parish donations, a reel of magnetic tape, unlabeled, sealed in brown paper. It had been tucked inside a hymnal, along with a note in Selby's handwriting, "Keep this where the music never ends." I met Lewis that afternoon in the listening room of the Bodleian, the air heavy with the scent of dust and varnish. We threaded the tape onto an old Revox machine. The sound began faintly static, a few clicks, and then the unmistakable hum of the chapel organ. But not a hymn, nor a rehearsal. It was the missing cantata. Selby's voice entered first, quiet and deliberate, reciting in Latin. Then another voice, a woman's clear, trembling, almost breaking on the higher notes. The duet was fragile, as though neither singer wished to be heard. I remember saying that it wasn't a performance, it was a recording of an argument. Lewis frowned, but I knew it at once, the pauses, the quickened tempo, the unspoken accusations folded into melody. Music had become their method of confession. Halfway through, a sound intruded, the slam of a door, the faint hiss of gas. The organ faltered, then resumed in a higher key, discordant, almost desperate. It ended abruptly, without coda. Silence filled the room like dust returning to air. Lewis wanted to play it again. I told him no, once is all truth deserves. That night I walked alone along Holywell Street, the lamps turning the wet cobbles into a string of dim reflections. The rain had begun again, fine and persistent. I thought of the photograph, of the woman between Selby and the organist. Her name, Eleanor Halberd, had revealed itself beneath the painting's frame, written in a hand that was neither Selby's nor the dead man's. The widow's maiden name. A symmetry began to take shape, as they always do in Oxford lives, intersecting under the illusion of chance. The organist, the widow, Selby, all part of a composition written in the wrong key, replayed until it destroyed its own harmony. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and stared at the crossword on the desk, one of those rare evenings when language felt like an intrusion. The clue that caught my eye read, "Repetition that alters meaning. 10. I wrote the answer without hesitation. I took the photograph from the drawer once more. Under the lamplight, the lilies had faded to grey ghosts, their shapes almost indistinguishable from the folds of her dress. Only the faintest smudge of her thumbprint remained visible at the edge of the frame. It was not the organist's hand that had been erased from the image years ago. It was hers. And it had been replaced. I saw it now in the faint overlap of shadow where Selby's hand rested on the other man's shoulder. Lewis came by the next morning with news that the organ in the chapel had been tampered with, a valve left loosened deliberately. The same fault that had supposedly killed the organist weeks before. The repairs, he said, had been authorized in writing by Mrs. Halberd. I did not tell him what I suspected. Some truths are too carefully composed to be destroyed by revelation. I only asked whether the reel had been returned to the archives. He said yes, though he had kept a copy. For evidence, he said. I nodded, though I doubted it would ever serve that purpose. Later, alone, I played the tape once more. I listened closely this time, past the words, and the trembling notes until I heard a faint exhalation at the very end. Not despair, nor relief. Something quieter, older, untranslatable. The sound of two people realizing too late that the music they had written together could only end one way. I switched off the recorder and sat in the stillness. Outside, the bells began their evening toll, 12 slow strikes, 12 variations on a theme I had heard all my life, the sound of endings disguised as continuance. And somewhere in the pause that followed, I thought I caught the faintest echo of Selby's refrain, clavis falsa, veritas vera. The wrong key, the true truth. It was late when I returned to the chapel. The key turned too easily in the lock, as if the door had been waiting for me. The air inside had that particular stillness reserved for places abandoned between rehearsals, the faint echo of music half remembered, the scent of polish and damp wood. The organ pipes loomed above the choir stalls like sentinels stripped of purpose. I told myself I had come only to confirm a suspicion. But the truth, as ever, was less tidy. Some part of me had needed to hear the silence again, to measure what was missing. The rehearsal room adjoined the choir vestry, reached by a short passage that smelled faintly of chalk and candle wax. When I opened the door, I found the space unchanged from the last time: two music stands, a stool, the metronome resting motionless on the piano, and there, on the window-sill, a wine-glass, cleaned but not perfectly. A thin ring of red still marked its base. Lewis would have called it evidence. I saw it as punctuation, a small, unfinished sentence left behind by a careful hand. I sat at the piano and pressed a single key, middle C. The sound wavered, slightly flat. A second note followed, hesitant, then a third. Together they formed the opening of Selby's lost cantata. I hadn't realized until that moment how much of it had remained in my head, how instinctively my fingers could find the melody's shape. It was not a piece written for performance. It was a private language, the sort of composition meant to be heard only once by the person for whom it was written. Halfway through, the music faltered. One of the notes rang false, as though the string beneath had been tampered with. I lifted the lid, tracing the hammers with my hand. The felt was torn where a small square of paper had been wedged beneath. I removed it carefully. A single line of writing in Selby's hand. Every rehearsal is a confession. It was not a message to me. It was an admission to himself of a line rehearsed, perhaps, before the final act. I walked to the far wall where a row of coat hooks hung beneath a faded notice board. There were photographs pinned there, curling at the corners past choirs, visiting conductors, one of Selby himself taken from behind as he directed the college festival. And there in the corner a torn fragment, the edge of another image. Someone had tried to remove it, but a sliver remained, showing the hem of a dark skirt, the suggestion of a hand resting on the piano's edge. I recognized that hand, the widow's. For a moment, everything aligned: the wine-glass, the photograph, the erased hand in the earlier portrait. Then, just as quickly, it slipped away. Truth never settles. It only circles. Outside, the bells began to toll the quarter hour, their sound flattening against the rain. I switched off the light and stood for a while in the half-dark, letting the room rearrange itself into memory. It seemed to me that Selby's crime had less to do with murder than with music. He had composed his guilt so precisely that it could only ever be decoded in sound. As I left, I locked the door behind me and placed the key on the lectern. The brass caught the faint gleam from the window, a last reluctant confession. I thought of the word inscribed on the photograph, reprise, to play again, but never the same way. Lewis asked later what I had found that night. I told him only that the room was empty, which was true in the way truth sometimes is incomplete, echoing, sufficient for silence. Back in my room, I poured a whiskey and wrote a single note in my diary. In music, the rehearsal is the only honest performance. Then I closed the book and let the rain have the last word. It was close to midnight when I entered the chapel for what I knew would be the last time. The door gave way with a sigh that seemed older than wood, as though the building itself were exhaling the final note of a long-forgotten hymn. The air inside was heavy with the scent of wax and rain-wax from the half-burnt candles left by the choir. Rain from the cloaks hung carelessly on the back pews. It was St. Cecilia's day, though no one in the college had remembered, no one except me, and perhaps Selby, wherever he had gone. The organ loomed in its usual silence. It had been tuned that afternoon, the verger told me, though no one had played it since. I found that curious. People are reluctant to touch what they sense is sacred, even when the holiness has already decayed. I sat where the choir boys used to gather, the wood still smooth from generations of shifting knees. The candlelight trembled across the pipes, catching in the dust. A kind of music existed in that stillness, an inaudible interval between what had been and what refused to end. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, muttering about reports, about closures and coroners, and the weariness of sense. I envied him then. I have never been at ease with endings neatly written down. I opened my notebook. Between its pages lay the photograph of the woman, the two men, the lilies. I had stopped trying to decide which of them I pitied more. The past is only cruel when we insist on measuring it against justice. My eyes fell to the organ again. The key, the brass one I'd found weeks before, lay on the step beside me. I hadn't meant to bring it, yet somehow it had followed me, as guilt often does. I rose and climbed the narrow stair to the loft. The instrument waited like an accusation. I switched on the small lamp above the music stand. Its circle of light revealed a single sheet left there. 3 bars of notation, nothing more. Beneath them, in Selby's hand, the words Sancta Cecilia, ora pro nobis. It was not a prayer, it was an apology. I pressed one of the keys, the sound emerged low and cracked. A breath pulled through an old throat. Then another, higher this time, answering it. Slowly, uncertainly, the notes began to find each other, the melody completing itself from memory. I realized with something close to dread that I was playing the same refrain from the lost cantata, the duet between Selby and the woman's voice. Halfway through I stopped, not because of guilt, but because of recognition. The piece was not unfinished, it was cyclical. The final bar led back to the beginning, endlessly repeating, like confession without absolution. That was his design, that was his punishment. I looked down from the loft to the nave below. Moonlight through the stained glass scattered the floor with fractured blues. For a moment I imagined the figures from the photograph standing there against Selby at the organ, the organist beside him, and the woman somewhere between them, as she had always been, half illuminated, half erased. The clock struck 12, St. Cecilia's hour. The hour when, legend said, every note ever played is briefly heard again, if one listens hard enough. I listened. At first, nothing, only the faint murmur of rain against the stone. Then, very softly, from the pipes behind me, a single note sounded. I hadn't touched the keys. It hung there, quivering, until another joined it. Two tones, imperfectly in tune, beating against each other like a pulse that refuses to settle. I stayed until the sound faded. There are moments, rare and unwelcome, when one feels the living step aside to make room for the dead. This was one of them. When I finally left, I locked the door and slid the key through the gap beneath it. The corridor beyond was colder, the air stripped of echo. Outside, the city slept under a film of drizzle, the cobbles shining like unopened letters. In my room later, I wrote only one line in my diary. Saint Cecilia hears the music we bury in silence. Then I closed it, turned out the lamp, and let the night continue the variation I no longer wished to play.